The ghosts of Hurricane Katrina. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that this story haunts me like a shadow, sucking out every shred of peace I once clung to. Back in September 2005, after Hurricane Katrina tore through New Orleans, I was assigned as part of the National Guard to patrol the devastated areas. But what we found there wasn't just physical destruction. It was an open wound in reality, bleeding memories that should have stayed buried. That night, my team was stationed at an abandoned building in Tremé, an old neighborhood where the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. The structure, a 3-story husk of a building, looked like a decayed carcass, shattered windows like broken teeth, walls stained with dark water that could have easily passed for dried blood. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like every breath cost double the effort. Around 2 a.m., as we tried to stay awake with lukewarm coffee, Mark froze, pointing toward the 3rd floor. His hand shook in a way I'll never forget. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. In the window stood a woman, or what was once a woman. Her skin had a sickly greenish tint, and water dripped endlessly from her soaked clothes, though there wasn't a drop of rain outside. Inside, the building felt like stepping into a sunken crypt. The smell wasn't just mildew, it was decay, the kind that sticks to your soul. Water dripped from the ceiling in an uneven rhythm, like the heartbeat of something on the verge of death. On the 3rd floor, we found more than just a photograph. An old chair sat drenched as if it had just been pulled from the floodwaters. The black and white photo showed the woman in her prime, but the longer we stared, the more it seemed to change. Her eyes darkened, and water stains spread across the paper like black tears. The next day, I got the news. Mark had vanished. 3 weeks later, they found his body, not on dry land or floating in the floodwaters still choking parts of the city. He was in that same building, on the 3rd floor, sitting in that same chair. His body was completely dry, yet his lungs were filled with salt water. The same salt water that had surged through the city during the storm. Clutched in his hands was the photograph, now warped and waterlogged, except for the woman's face, which remained intact, her smile frozen. The coroner's report was the most chilling part. The water in Mark's lungs contained sediment unique to the bottom of the industrial canal, the very spot where the teacher's body had been discovered weeks after Katrina. She had been trapped in her classroom as the waters rose, pounding on the windows until her final breath. Even now, years later, I wake up every night at 2 a.m. I hear knocking at my door. I never open it. I never will. But I know someday, maybe I won't have a choice because Mark didn't either. The Children Who Wander. Story submitted by Alex, a former soldier and night watchman in San Bernardino, California. When I took the job as a night watchman, I thought it'd be just another monotonous phase in my life. But in that housing complex rebuilt after the Great Quake of 2017, I learned that some children's laughter can freeze even a war veteran's soul. I left the Army in 2022, carrying scars no doctor could see. I needed to support my family, so I took a job as a security guard at Hilltop Heights, a housing complex rebuilt after the earthquake that devastated San Bernardino. The place had a heavy energy, like the air itself was soaked with the screams of that tragic night. The first nights tested my sanity. The silence wasn't the kind that brought peace, it was the kind that screamed death. Occasionally, that silence was broken by noises no living creature should make. One night, under a new moon, it started. A frantic woman approached me, pointing toward the swings. There was a girl, no older than 11, her white dress stained with dark red. But it wasn't just blood. There was concrete dust, and something that looked like bone marrow. Her neck twisted at an impossible angle, and through her tangled hair I could see fragments of bone protruding from her skin. By the time we reached the playground, she was gone. But the smell lingered, a mix of rust, damp concrete, and decay. The swing still swayed, creaking out a chilling melody. The laughter began the next night. It wasn't cheerful. It was distorted, as if it were forced through crushed throats. A ball rolled toward me, leaving a wet trail of something that wasn't water. When I picked it up, it was warm and sticky, coated in a dark substance that shimmered under my flashlight. An older resident finally shared the full story. "The kids were playing when the building collapsed," he said, his voice shaking. "Tommy was crushed instantly, but his sister Sarah, she survived for 3 days trapped under the rubble, clawing at the concrete until her nails were gone. Following his advice, I began leaving offerings, but it wasn't just toys and candy that disappeared. Bloody drawings started appearing on the playground walls. Smiling children holding hands with adults whose faces were violently scratched out. My last night at Hilltop Heights was the worst. The laughter turned into screams. Bloody footprints covered the playground, and there they were, dozens of children, their earthquake injuries grotesquely preserved, calling for me to play. Tommy and Sarah stood in front, their decomposed hands reaching out for me. I requested a transfer the next morning, but they followed me. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the exact time of the quake, I hear children laughing outside my kids' room. When I check, they're sound asleep, but their toys are arranged in a circle on the floor. In the center, there's always a message written in chalk: "We miss you, Uncle Alex." 3 months after writing his account, Alex was found dead in his apartment. Official cause, cardiac arrest. But his face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. Around him were dozens of childlike drawings created with a dark, unidentifiable substance. Each one depicted Alex, eternally playing with his new children. The woman in the doghouse. Story recovered from Michael's diary after his disappearance in Montgomery, Alabama. "I was never afraid of the dark. Now I can't sleep without every light on. And even then, through the cracks in the curtains, I still see those eyes watching me from the doghouse." It was 2022, and I lived with my mom and older brother in a secluded house on the outskirts of Montgomery. Our property was the last one on a dirt road that twisted through abandoned fields. In the backyard stood an old doghouse, which had been empty since the mysterious death of our last pet. It had become a place where rusty tools went to die. That night, I was home alone. The silence was broken only by the hum of an old TV and the whisper of wind through the dead trees in the yard. Then, I heard it. 2 knocks at the door. They weren't normal knocks. They sounded like bones tapping against wood. The clock read 3:33 a.m. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the knocking had a specific rhythm. Knock, knock, pause, knock, knock, like brittle fingers drumming on the wood. Through the window, all I could see was darkness. But something about that darkness was wrong. It seemed to pulse. I went back to the couch, convincing myself it was just the wind. But the knocking continued, growing more insistent. Then I noticed something that froze me to the core. The sound wasn't coming from just the front door anymore. It was at every door, every window all at once. It felt like the house was surrounded. The next morning, our neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, came to talk to my mom. Her face was pale and her hands trembled as she clutched her rosary. "You need to know," she whispered. "Every night she's there. A woman in a white dress, but it's not a dress. It looks like a shroud covered in wet dirt," Mrs. Martinez continued, her voice trembling like a lament. "She stands at your door for hours, her neck twisted at an impossible angle, and when the moon reaches a certain point in the sky, she crawls to the doghouse. But the way she moves, no living thing moves like that." A few days later, while cleaning the doghouse, my mom found more than just a dirty rag. Deep scratches marked the wooden walls inside, cutting into the live wood. In the darkest corner, there was a pile of damp soil that smelled of decay. When she touched it, it was warm. The knocking didn't stop. It escalated. Now every night at 3:33, I hear a woman's voice calling my name. It's distorted, as if her throat is full of dirt. And through my bedroom window, I see her sitting in the doghouse, her pale face always turned toward me. Last week, I made the mistake of looking directly at her. Her eyes, they weren't eyes. They were black voids pulling in the light around them, and she smiled, a smile that stretched far beyond the limits of any human face. Tonight is my last night in this house. I can't take it anymore. The knocking is louder and the voice won't stop calling. I left a camera recording the doghouse, hoping to prove I'm not insane. But when I checked the footage this morning, I saw something that made me decide to leave immediately. In the video, the woman was standing in my room. She was behind me as I slept, her distorted face grinning impossibly wide, her long, dark fingers gently stroking my hair. Michael vanished the night he wrote this entry. The only clue left behind was a trail of damp soil leading from his bedroom to the doghouse. When investigators opened it, they found only a small white cloth and a broken camera. From the camera's memory card, one image was recovered. Michael, sitting inside the doghouse, smiling. Beside him was a woman in white. Her face was turned toward the camera, revealing nothing but darkness where her features should have been. The timestamp on the photo was 3 days after Michael's disappearance.